Today, the topic is the wildman, and I'm so excited to welcome Jeremy back to the podcast. Jeremy, thank you for being here. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see that we are in my front yard in Asheville, and you might hear some birds, you might hear some airplanes, you might hear some background noises, and it's thematically on point for this episode because I want to explore the wildman, but specifically, how do we integrate that into the modern world? And Jeremy has been leading wildman retreats in Asheville this is your year 10, I believe, right now. Mm-hmm. And it's powerful, powerful work. Jeremy, welcome again. Anything you'd like to say up front?
Great. Thank you, Taylor. And it's great to be out in your wild front yard here and absorbing all the sounds of mountain and suburbia simultaneously.
Yep.
Something that many people have to sit with constantly. I mean, some people don't even have the benefit of the trees in the urban centers. So really hope we can reach out today to all those men and women who are also listening to this and hopefully provide them with some great cues into the dreaming of the wild man.
Yeah.
I would say the one thing I would lead with that is probably most important is like that wild man really, that archetype really helps to hone a sense of place and belonging in this world. And I think that's probably one of the keys that we'll revisit throughout our conversation today.
Yeah. And that's really something that's missing for a lot of people today, too, is this sense of belonging, this sense of connection, this sense of place, and the sense of aliveness. And I think it's worth mentioning up front just the context that we all live in. Like, we have smartphones that connect us to anything we could possibly want to know in our pockets all the time. They're binging notifications at us. We have city noises. We have people who are just everywhere, advertising and distractions. And there's a lot that's pulling on our consciousness. There's a lot that's pulling on our awareness. And it takes actual dedication and practice to just be, number one, a functioning human. I think so in a modern world. But number two, like a thriving human that's connected to our aliveness. So let's start off with, what is this wild man? Is it a person? Is it an archetype? Is it energy? How does it, if somebody were to ask you on the street, what's the wild man, Jeremy? What would you say?
Yeah, I would say it's multifold, but the simple answer that draws first to my mouth is the feeling of a sense of belonging, connection to nature. The wild man, some people might refer to it as the green man. In the Irish, we would call it a farwinye, the green forest man, like the being who is an extension of nature. And so typically that's what most people draw up images of when they think of the wild man. For myself, personally, the connection of the wild man is the following of intuition, the following of dreams, discerning between dreams that are entertainment dreams, dreams that are distraction dreams, dreams that are just me working out sexual frustrations or psychological frustrations, but true dreaming that helps to lead us on into a deeper relationship, not just with ourselves, but how that then becomes an expression in a healthy way with the environment around us.
Yeah. So I'm really hearing there's a connection piece, like a connection to nature and a connection to the nature that's within. And from that place, there's almost a blooming of aliveness, or this force that, inspires and gives life to intentional action in the world.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's awesome and beautiful to hear that, because I think a lot of guys, so men's work is one thing that's sort of, exploding all over the place right now, which is awesome. It's great. Like, we need that. We need places to gather outside of typical therapy offices, And I think there's a lot of guys, when they think of the wild man, they think, oh, it's just a bunch of dudes just like screaming and beating their chest, and kind of getting off on that. And while that wildness is a part of it, and I've experienced it, and it's amazing and powerful and liberating to experience that, there's also this depth that you're talking about. That's, yes, you can beat and pound your chest, but also it sounds like there's this foundation of a spring almost coming up from the earth that is aliveness inside.
Yeah, I think a spring is a great way to describe it, because it's more of this quiet, gentle bubbling up. It's a sense of, we already spoke into the belonging, but just this really strong sense of peace and nourishment, and that there is this presence of life-giving energy ever present. And that sometimes, yes, we need to raise the energy and beat our chests and howl. I mean, that's our ancestral and genetic memory of preparing to defend our people or to defend our turf or to go out on the hunt and to get ourselves, kind of like what you and I just did before we started this podcast. We're doing push-ups and jumping up and down and making noises and shaking our, it's just like getting the energy, and then we can settle back into the quiet.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's all take a breath to that. Everyone listening to. I was recently at a men's retreat out in the desert about a month ago, and one of our tasks to do was to go out into the desert and not do for an extended period of time and just sit there, to just be and be with the quiet. And it was really powerful. And I realized this is something that I don't do very much of. But we also prepped the whole experience of doing that by doing a lot of different embodiment type exercises and things that really got us into our sensing body, into our senses, into our felt aliveness. And then from that place, we went and we sat. And almost everybody that did that got some really useful message for their life, whether that be their sexual relationship or their work or what they're wanting to do with their time in general or something. Almost always some kind of information, if you want to call it, came through that experience. And yeah, it was potent, and didn't plan to share that, but it just seemed appropriate based on what you just said.
Yeah, and I think part of what brought that on was, yesterday evening I went out we have this family of 5 screech owls living in the white oak behind our house. And so sometimes I can go out right at dusk and start calling to them. And first the juveniles will come in and they just kind of squawk, and then the adults will come in, and it's this whole exchange. And we've gotten them to come within a couple of feet of us, which is so beautiful. But to just lay there in the hammock last night and watching the twilight play on the underside of the white oak and the hickory and the poplar, and just feel that liminal space in my own mind that is able to soften when I let go of all the planning and logistics and structure, and just soften into allowing the presence of nature to flow in and change the expression of who I am.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you say, for people listening who don't know what liminal space might mean, can you just say a couple words about that? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so classically, liminal, at least in the context that I know of it, both speaks to consciousness as well as to ecology. Being an ecologist professionally by trade, one of the things that I like, what is utilized for the term liminal or liminal shelf, is a place where several different types of communities come together. There's an overlap. So the liminal zone, where it's almost aqueous or almost water, it's almost terrestrial, it's almost air. And so there's this whole zone where all these nutrients gather. And so it's sort of this space in between. And so that same utilization has been brought into consciousness and psychology in respect to, it's this place where many worlds fold, or many wavelengths of our mental or spiritual process overlay, and in that space in between, and what also in ecology as well as in ancient Greek we call the ecotone, where the music of many aspects of life come together.
Yeah, it's this where things meet, but also it's that space where things meet, kind of like between consciousness and sleep. For most people, that's an easily accessible realm of, it's different than.
Yes, it's different. There you go.
Something is different than, like, I can go on journeys, or sometimes I find myself in all, different. And there's a potency there.
Yes.
Cool. Thanks for that. So, just to briefly touch on archetypes before we go forward, I do want to talk about how the wildman can be incorporated into sex and life and business and relationship, and also just to touch on, like, what is an archetype too, because I've heard a lot of people talking about archetypes, but I don't know that I've heard somebody say this is actually, here's the function of an archetype. Like, what would you say to that?
As far as my understanding, I mean, again, you spoke earlier to being in the information age. Somebody can go fact check all of these things.
Yeah.
However, the thing that I feel is like really important for myself is the embodiment of knowledge and how we carry it and convey it. So I'm going to speak from that place. And so archetypes come from Freudian psychology or Jungian psychology, one of those two branches of early 1900s where we have an understanding, like we're riding out of the end of the Romantic period, the end of the 19th century, where there was all of this evolution and understanding that was coming into the modern awareness, especially in the Western mind, of these different ancient traditions, whether they were the Mayan glyphs that were being discovered. At that time, the hieroglyphs had been found in Egypt and were just around the year 1900 were beginning to be able to be translated. So there was this, all of a sudden there's this whole understanding that there's these other world views where there's all these ancient gods, where we're not talking about a monotheistic society like we're in the West, but a polytheistic. And so the idea of the archetype is that from a scientific or psychological perspective, our consciousness is connected to various aspects of these ancient deities, and then it separates it from a religious context and brings it into just a psychological context, which is why around at the same time, like the Rider-Waite deck, the Tarot deck was created. Like all of this evolution of human consciousness and understanding that there is more than one voice that can presence itself in terms of our inner counsel that guides us. And so the wildman is, of course, just one of those archetypes. A very important one because it's our primordial root and it's our connection to the world. It's our connection to our fellow men or to our partners, our lovers. Yet at the same time, it is a part. So archetype is a aspect, a fractal of the divine. I sometimes like to speak to it from the sense of light is pure. When light waves hit a crystal or a fractal or a fracture in a crystal, I mean, all of that works, essentially gets us to the same place, a broken surface that then the light breaks up into these different rays that we know as a rainbow. We have all these different wavelengths and then these micro wavelengths that are in the overlap between, and each of those is part of the great light. However, it's very obviously red. Like we can just, it's like a fractal of the whole. So,
got it. I like that because it brings the esoteric into the practical and into the felt sense of the body. Like when I think of the wild man archetype or any of the archetypes, like some of the most or more familiar ones for people in the men's work world, you have the king, warrior, magician, lover, right? And this, it's almost like it's a flavor of reality, like a flavor of consciousness that doesn't exist outside of us, but like it exists within us and in the rest of the world. And with some practice and some attunement, we can actually enter that and become that.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with that?
Very much so. Yeah. Very much so.
So before we were filming this episode, there's this whole process of setting up microphones and cameras and settings and apertures and white balance and sound levels and dealing with the background noise. And it's all this sort of like heady type stuff. And when we first started to sit down, I realized like, I am way too much up in my head. I've got to move. I got to get into my body. And so when we were doing push-ups, I was also tuning into the energetic of that aliveness, of the wild creature, like doing physical motion while also, and I didn't have to like scream, but I was just like if I were to slow it down, like that's what was happening internally for me. And it was really helpful to then just land here.
And what you just went through there too is a very important part of our species' natural heritage and history, a very important need. When we prepared ourselves in prehistoric times all the way up into the modern to go on the hunt, there's an energy change we have to go through in order to make that hunt successful. But then we have to integrate back in with our wives, our lovers, our children, our elders. And we can't just come back in, blood covering our faces and everything. Like we got to come in a way that we can be embraced. We have to go and bathe ritually before we come home. We prepare the meat so that when we pack it back home, it can be open and accepted. And I think that also translates into the modern age and the historic era of warfare, where traditionally, mostly men would go off to war, and then they have to have some sort of transition period back into our secular world. Otherwise, we get blindsided, or we're still mentally on the hunt, still mentally in battle.
Totally.
Really crucial.
Yeah. And I imagine, so I was not part of the military. I've not been to war, but I imagine if we did have more of an honoring process around that, we might have less occurrences of PTSD and other types of post-war like challenges for people. Like some of my friends are veterans, and they've still, they struggle with that whole realm of stuff, you know? So that seems like an important piece. And I've got a list of, I have an organized list of topics I wanted to go to, but I want to divert a little bit. And I think that's part of following the aliveness of the conversation too. The whole stepping away to, recenter, reground, rewild, or then reintegrate. I'm remembering a time where my partner and I, and she's up on the porch right now, we were going into sexual intimacy together, and there was something that just wasn't quite right. You know, like if you're in a long-term relationship, inevitably there are times when you just shit happens, and sometimes it's about nothing or like a very small thing. And so it came up, then like some sort of bickering, and I thought, this sucks. Like, I don't want to do this right now. But I also wanted to have the experience of intimacy. So I remembered, I can just take some space. This is probably about nothing. And I went outdoors and I did a bunch of push-ups and I did jumping jacks and I growled and I just got in my body and I tried to like let out whatever needed to be let out and then access that part of myself that was just raw aliveness. And then stood there for a little bit, felt it and breathed with it, and went back in. And from that place of grounding, from that place of aliveness, was able to, you could say, just seed the interaction with that energy. Then we had a beautiful lovemaking, you know? And it came from intentionally going to access this kind of energy and bring it back with practice.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we forget about in our modern day is the importance of a threshold, the importance of crossing from one place to another, whether it's from the secular to the sacred, from the secular to the sexual. However, we are crossing a threshold from one way of engaging the world, one type of consciousness, into another. And again, in the modern age, we're constantly, like you said earlier, like we're information sharing, we're jumping between mental portals that are completely existent online. There's all these ways that we can just jump ship very rapidly. And so we have forgotten the importance of honoring when we cross over into another space. And I think that that's something that's really important, especially in respect to the wildman archetype. I had an experience, you'll remember Ayla's mom and I years ago, we lived up in Cincinnati for a while, and I had a project out in British Columbia, and there was this forest spirit that came to me and was just like, all these ancient cedars are being cut down, like, can you help us with this? You know, I was just like, sure. And then all of a sudden it was almost like there was this like slight spirit possession going on, and it created this like really intense energy where I was just like, all of a sudden I'm having a hard time being present in the business world and being present for what I had actually gone to British Columbia to do, which was make a presentation on ecological restoration in the Southern Appalachian Mountains. And so there was this like pull away from like aligning with this ancient energy, which is really important. But for where I was engaged in my life in that moment, that was not a particular aspect, a particular archetype, a particular aspect of the divine and embodiment of the wild man that I could fully embody. I mean, that embodiment is for those who are with Earth First and on the front line, and for those who are willing to let go completely of the world and live out in the bush. Like, do it, please. Some of us need to keep doing that to hold that anchor down. And then some of us have to go through things like setting up electronics and changing mental structures, because that's just like when we were talking about earlier, coming back to our community with the hunt, with everything that we've gathered. We have to transition in order so that now this will actually feed the community and not be something that's destructive. Like, here, you get to eat, but I'm going to hit you over the side of the head because I'm pissed off inside at the same time. Like, that doesn't work. honoring thresholds.
Yeah, I like that. So I didn't tell you I was going to ask you to do this up front, but people listening right now, and for us here too, but we all have access to this energetic, if you want to call it, this flavor of reality internally. And I wonder if you could speak to that part of the person who's listening right now. Is there a way you can speak to or evoke wanting to bring in a felt sense of, because for some people this feels foreign or like a foreign language, you know?
So I'm going to open with saying in the last year, I've walked over 1,000 kilometers on pilgrimage. And what I have found in the walking pilgrimage is that there's a way that we as humans, sedentary, not moving a lot. Yeah, maybe we work out every once in a while or something like that, but we don't move a lot. Things in our mind become so much more complicated than they actually are. Inputs, stresses, hurdles. When we're constantly in motion, hunter-gatherer is constantly in motion, pilgrim walking across a sacred landscape supported in that, there is a way that our mind is able to quickly untangle things or very quickly understand when something is not, I'm the walker, I'm passing by something, I could stop and help or I couldn't. It's either one or the other. There's not a complex, like, well, society tells me this or blah, 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 blah. I am going to either stop and help or I'm going to keep walking.
Yeah.
Like there are open doors, there's closed doors. We choose how we move through it. So I think one of the things that a lot of us have been feeling a rise of, and I'm speaking personally in this as well, but from what I hear from a lot of other men and women as well, is that post-COVID, there's been this this rise of a sense of like physical anxiety inside the chest, inside the belly. Like all of us to some extent feel that because a couple of things happen. We had the opportunity to stop, pause and be like, are we liking where we're going as a culture? Are we liking where I am going as an individual? How am I going to continue engaging with the world? And we had the opportunity to start resetting that in a cultural way that we just never have had, at least in our lifetimes. And so I feel that the most important thing that we can do when we start feeling those anxieties or those tensions or just feeling like the modern world is just too much is emulate what our ancestors do. Go for a run. I just did that yesterday. I went for a 2.5 mile run because that energy was building up so much. And I went for a run and there was just like 3 hours of just complete internal silence. Like, it's not spending 2 or 3 weeks walking on the Camino or walking on some other pilgrimage, or I'm not actually going on a boar hunt with you and a few other men out in the forest. But what I am doing is I am getting into the place where my body's not holding these complex abstractions and entanglements of the mind, and I'm breathing it out. I'm sweating it out, putting it back into the earth. So that's a doing. A non-doing is to cyclical breathing, similar to like how you and I started also this afternoon. It's just taking a moment to just really connect and become present. Two great doors.
And that seems like the crucial piece is presence and taking a moment. And it's not a mental concept that you can like turn the mental switch and then conceptually enter, but it seems like you have to do something with your body to create a felt sense of it. I'm remembering, try to make an analogy here, see if it works. Sleep is something that I used to struggle with a bunch, and I went to sleep therapy a while ago and learned some really interesting things. But one of the things that they said that stuck with me was you can't think your mind into a state of ease. You know, you have to create that through your body or through practices, through some sort of embodiment or laying down or something, right? You have to generatively do that. And it seems very similar to this. And I imagine even just taking 3 breaths, you could access it, you know, or just standing, going for a walk barefoot on the earth or something like that. It's always right there, but just making the choice to step into it somehow.
Something I've really noticed over the last 5 years, this started pre-pandemic, but just to give kind of a context, is in the last 5 years, I've noticed a massive decline in terms of the human ability to presence itself to a situation. In particular, in respect to programs and retreats that I've helped to facilitate or participated in, either way. But like in the context of facilitating, I've noticed that it's almost like 25% more time needs to be added to any program just to create direct experience to allow people to land in their bodies and leave all of the entanglements behind. And while some of that was needed 5 years back and further, not as much. Like it's almost to the T, everyone shows up to some sense. Pulled out, distracted.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, you know, and I can resonate and relate to what you're saying about pre and post COVID. And I feel like sometimes, it seems like just the overall level of neurosis, even internally, has been amplified through that experience, just across the board. And people seem angrier in their cars when they're driving, less patience in line, just like all the just tiny little things that give evidence to the fact that there's something else sort of teeming under the surface that isn't quite settled.
Right.
You know?
Right. And I feel like, you know, to pivot back into what brings us here together today is like that essence of the wild man. There's two variants of the wild man. There's the healthy wild man, which is what we're seeking to access. And there's the twisted wild man, which, going back to my story of the cedar trees, you know, it's like, there's that variant, which is like, okay, you're connecting to this essence of this deep nature, but then is it twisting you into conflict with those that you love? Is it twisting you into conflict with the people that you are surrounded by, the culture and the community that you're in? Can you reintegrate? Can you untwist that to the healthy wild man? Right.
Yeah, which is a great segue into, because I wanted to talk about, is there an integrated and unintegrated wild man? And this is what
certainly.
You're talking about.
I feel like this is a great pivot into that because, again, we've got the extreme examples of the healthy wild man who are right now living in the bush. They will never hear this podcast, never watch this YouTube video. Maybe will never be on the internet, except maybe to check an email once every 3 months or something like that. And hats off to them. You're my heroes. And I'm engaged in the world. And very much so. And so I feel that that's one extreme. The other extreme is the brother who's sitting in an office in Manhattan and is running a business, whether it's a multinational or just a local business, but is running a business. And even though they're fully engaged in the world, they still touch that healthy place of how they relate with their employees, how they relate with their board members, how they relate with the physical world. And it's shaped by a deep, intrinsic value system that is based in being in relationship respectfully and in reciprocity with the rest of the world, however that presents itself to us. I do not feel like the wild man archetype is going to become manifest in each man, or even in women, or in it's like their expression is going to be unique. Like your expression is unique. My expression is unique. We find these crossovers. We cross over in music, or we cross over in programmatic things like we're doing here. We're both willing to take that step to come to that watering hole. Yet at the same time, like what we're doing with I'm out descrying natural communities and working on conservation and preservation projects around the world. And I come back, you are really engaged in this way with men's healthy sexuality and how they engage in the world. Oh, really important flavors. It's just a band of that rainbow split by the fractal of a fragment or a break in a crystal as the light is passing through. So I feel like it's really important to honor that and acknowledge that there's never going to be a one-stop shop. This is how you be a healthy wild man. I think anybody that ever tries to present that, well, I would turn away immediately.
For $777,
you can be a certified wild man.
My 3-hour workshop. That does feel really important to say, because there's one of the things I've also seen a lot, especially in the social media world, is people, I present ideas too, but people present ideas of like, this is the way that things are. And then because we're humans and because of our psychology, like we there's just so much comparison that happens. Like, oh, do I fit into that box too? Do I fit their definition of this? Is this the overall arching definition of this particular thing? Do I fit? I don't know. And it's risky, and it's tricky territory. The comparison thing, like, they say comparison is the thief of joy. But circling back around, all that is to say that it does seem really important to honor that this wildman energy is going to show up differently in everybody's life. And there might be some similarities here and there, but yeah, it's going to be a different flavor of reality for each person. And then perhaps the measure of integrated or unintegrated becomes the level of positive or negative impact on a person's community and relationships and friends. Like, what's the impact of this? Like, if your wild man looks like screaming and yelling and, flailing around and having a wild time and just going nuts, great, but is that then making people feel unsafe around you, or are you like making people want to separate themselves from you? Or on the flip side, are you doing it in a context that actually inspires other people to be that themselves, right? Because that could be an amazing thing to do in the right context. So there's I've been geeking out about the word attunement recently, and it seems really appropriate in this context too.
Yeah, I think attunement, and also like what we were speaking to earlier, threshold, like the difference between that lad like rolling around and being chaotic versus someone doing it in a way that will help others to do it in a healthy way is they're going to create a container. They're going to connect logically, mentally. It's an effort, just like setting up all this equipment. You had to do that so that we could get this conversation out to the world. Like, that was a choice. Yeah. And now people can enter into it at their own comfort level, listen to what they will, and the same level. So you go back to the guy flipping around versus someone that creates a container and closes a container, creates a threshold. Yeah. Then people will be like, oh, here's a context. I can leave my own inhibitions behind, or I can leave my logical mind behind for a moment, and I can just roll in the mud and ashes and wrestle with these other 20 people, get wild, scream, cry, beat our fists into the mud, go jump in the cold waterfall, and then come back together. How was that? Back out to the world. Yeah.
So do you see in the wildman retreats that you do you see that most guys are just, backstory, I've attended also, it's great. But do you see that what you just talked about is easily accessible for most guys to just jump right into it?
Yes.
In the right context.
In the right context, because again, it's creating a container, creating barriers, sacred barriers that men have to choose consciously to step across because it's being acknowledged as such. If we draw a line between us on the grass right now and I say, okay, if you cross that line, then that means this, you know? And so of course there's always going to be people who just kind of mentally do it, cross the line and step into whatever the experience is. Yeah. And something will come from it. But for those who actually take the time, like you did before, going back into that sort of pulling apart of you and your lover, like taking the time to go out, work it out of your body, and then come back in and enter. You did the prep work. Yeah. You harrowed the soil so that then you could enter in a really beautiful way. And it was probably amazing sex after that. Yeah. Because she probably did something similar in her own way. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, with the wild man, like that's very much the container is set up so that we enter into these specific moments with these specific rituals that are tied to the elements, and then they're closed. And then we move back into social and community and interaction. And so that creates that space for men to fully enter. Yeah. To the best of their capability. Yeah. And then also I think it's really important, to have examples like myself or yourself as embodied men who are willing to A, do the thing, and then B, embody it, so that then it sets a template. It creates the permission for someone who might have more inhibitions to be like, oh, yeah, I could throw all my clothes in the fire and cover myself with mud and go walk through the forest under the full moon for a mile with no flashlight, barefoot, and just trust. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to make a little note here because there's two things that I want to touch on and I don't want to lose them. And the first one is just to say that you mentioned the experience with my lover again. And
just want to say that most people who have sex with men, like they want, like some part of them really wants to experience this wildness coming from the man. Like people crave this, you know, like most guys, and I fall into this too, and it's a practice, but like we can be very up in our head and we're very good at calculating things and organizing things and making shit happen in the world. But then again, that threshold to switch into the lovemaking space can be tricky. And a lot of times we'll end up there still in our heads, or maybe afraid even to unleash or to be that wild, animalistic, attuned version of ourselves that like will drive our lovers wild. Like they want that. Mm-hmm. So just to acknowledge that that is a deeply desired experience by my partner, by, I'm guessing your partner too, by people everywhere. And then also to say I recognize and understand and want to empathize with the fact that a lot of guys feel fear to go into that space. Like, yes, in lovemaking, but then I imagine some guys, even in the wildman workshop, there's still that little blip of like, oh God, is this okay? Or like, or what will people think of me? Or does this mean I'm an unsafe man? You know, I'd imagine at the in-person wildman event, the container is set to experience that thing. That's specifically, right. Which is fucking awesome and sometimes needed. And I know in sex, sometimes the fear is, oh, if I become the wild man, then I'm the unsafe, I'm the unhealthy, toxic, whatever, masculine. I don't believe in that word, but I know it's like, it was said so much that it has gotten infused into some people's psyches, right? You know? So I just want to acknowledge and empathize with that fear and also say that the world really wants it. Right. Too.
And I think on behalf, you know, there's a lot of trauma in our culture, both in women and men, some of it, you know, coming from all different places. And so for some women or men, whoever, you know, whatever this lovership is related to, there's certain thresholds that need to be crossed before that being can be released. And so I think that's another really important part of doing men's work, whether you're just, you know, bringing that back to your bed and your lover or to your business world, but is recognizing that wild feral energy, misdirected or undirected, can be very harmful. And that's where a lot of the women's deep traumatic experiences come from. Yeah. And so I feel like it's really important to have containers like what you just did out west, what we do with Wildman here in the Southern Appalachian Mountains, what they do with the Mankind Project. Like, there are all these amazing containers that allow men that have been buried, suppressed, and crushed by their parents or other authorities or however in their mental construct that appears, like to be able to start to safely come out and try to express aspects of self, because that can also go really far south in the other direction where it's like, oh my gosh, I've never touched this part. And then they go home and they hurt their partner. Right. Because A, their partner's not used to it, or B, their partner may deeply want that, but she or he may also be coming from a place of sexual trauma, abuse. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done between them as well as individuals before that truly can come out. I mean,
and so this is the integration of the wildman. That's right. Like, that is the work to integrate this, like, yes, with your lover, with your work in a practical way. Yes. You know? And then to make the jump to work, like, you're not going to show up to a boardroom meeting or to a place with your employees and be like, all right, we're going to talk about the ecological sensors and, you know, scream. Maybe you do. I don't know. No. But it seems like it might freak some people out. Right. But I imagine there's a way you do and you have and you could show up in those meetings tuned into and tapped into that place internally, and then channel it through action and presence and consciousness with the people that you're with in a generative way that positively uplifts people.
100%. Yeah, I think that is the art of the refinement of this particular type of archetype. Yeah. And it, you know, in terms of playing with two major archetypes, the wildman and the king archetype, like, they can't exist without the other. A twisted wild man will create a twisted king. A twisted king will create a twisted wild man, or will twist the energy that the current of belonging in place, nature, thought leadership can then get morphed and turned into something that is an abstraction from the true root of the individual current moving through each man.
Yeah. Let's pivot again, because you said something that came up. I forget where it was recently. I got into this conversation and it seemed juicy and it relates. You mentioned the king archetype, and there are a lot of people these days who will use that archetype and use the queen archetype too, and refer like, I'm building my kingdom or I'm building my queendom. And I think there's value to that. And the conversation that was happening was, could it also be problematic to orient towards that? How do I say this? Like saying I'm in my king archetype before actually being there. Like, what are the problems that creates? And is there another way to say, like, I'm working towards that, or I'm working on my, like, building this thing? Or do you see what I'm saying there? There's a dissonance between...
I think I'm just going to run with it where it takes me instead of like trying to pigeonhole myself into. Like, the thing that comes alive for me is for everyone listening to this, for you and I to remember, is that if we're going to use the word archetype, of course that sets up a structure in our minds already. We're talking about psychology. Mm-hmm. And so we're talking about an aspect that we're aligning to, and that there are many voices there, and that a king without a council exists in a nebulous place that can be destructive, no matter how and positively intentful the beginning place of the root of where that concept of growing into king grows from. Energy is energy. It doesn't just appear. I mean, in the 21st century, you know, with many people being removed from nature and the environment and actual resources, like, every dollar that is spent is in some way connected to something tangible at the earth level somewhere. Somewhere something was extracted. Yeah. Somewhere something was lost so that it could be gained somewhere else. So a king functioning without the voice of the entire council, without the queen, without the princess, without the sage, without the wildman, without the warrior, with et cetera, et cetera. We can, there's hundreds of archetypes. Many of them are major, like what they would call in the tarot, the major arcana, like the major players. But these major archetypes all need to be a part of decision making. And, plenty of history has shown us that when an emperor or king does not listen to counsel, the amount of chaos and destruction it brings into the world is exorbitant.
Yeah. Huge. I like that. Thanks for taking that direction.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the piece, because, well, that is a massive piece. And there have been all these articles, and I think even one of I forget which health medical body or whatever it was, like, made a declaration in the past few years that loneliness and isolation is actually like the big epidemic that's going on right now. Like, people just feel disconnected. People aren't having good community experiences. People have a hard time finding friends and building friends. And so there's that, like, where's the council? And the importance of that feels really, really important, both for this archetype and for the world. So thanks for bringing that in. Because I've noticed even in myself, playing with those energies, that when, like, I can, as the trope goes, you can go very fast alone.
That's right.
Or you can go much farther in connection with other people.
Yes.
So let's take a breath to that.
Yes.
Love the sound of those birds. So let me consult my list. We've really talked about most of the things on my list, which is great. I'm wondering, just to give people an option, if you could give, we've already talked about it some, but, like, what are 3 things that you found are really helpful for guys to connect with this part of themselves? What can somebody do after listening to this today in their own world?
Yeah, I think that probably the most important thing is listening to self and respect too. So again, not isolating ourselves from the world, not isolating ourselves from the various voices of reason or excitement or illumination that come to us, but through introspection, reflection, questioning the deeper why behind things. I mean, I love Simon Sinek's whole what, like talk that he gave on TED Talk years ago, because it really helps to focus in on like the most important thing is why you're doing it. So through introspection, developing a relationship with the deeper why, moving with purpose. Like when we do a fire walk at Wildman, like that's one of the biggest teachings behind it is like, here's something that's over 1,000 degrees. Your feet are made out of skin. Like, does it make sense? You're going to, like move with purpose across. Like walking a pilgrimage was like an extended version of that. I never thought walking a pilgrimage would be as mentally and spiritually challenging as it was, but like hot feet for bricks, or bricks for for feet, like are basically what I felt at the end of the first few days. And like that experience of having to move through something and finding that deeper purpose through the discipline, through the introspection. So I'd say that's probably the most important thing.
Got it.
I think the second thing that I would bring is the willingness to take risks. I mean, everyone has a different risk tolerance. Everyone has their different financial plans and what types of things they invest in. And the same thing goes for how we engage with the world. Like you and I might have similar risk tolerances. Somebody else that I'm talking to might have a super low risk tolerance. Like, so having, again, understanding of who you are, and then once you have an understanding of who you are, what you're willing to do with that is really important, because then that is what will project us into the world, bring us to the physical experiences, the crossroads with other humans, to use a hunter-gatherer technology or terminology. Like we come to the crossroads and we exchange information, and then we go out more informed and able to complete certain tasks in a hybridized way. So I feel like that's probably the second most important thing. Third,
just a note on those first two things. Like also what I'm hearing is it's important to not just be all up in your technology and phone, and actually take a pause from the input to be able to do those things. It sounds like
inhale, exhale. We have to do both.
Yeah.
And the same thing goes with our minds. And we might, unless somebody has what do they call it? Obviously I don't have it, like a photographic memory where they remember everything that they ingest. Very, very few people have that. The difference of having access to information constantly allows most people to actually not know anything. So my invitation is do what it takes to embody it, become it. Memorize things, do math problems, practice memorization of poetry, so you can practice the memorization of patterns, because the same way as our minds encapsulate and harness information from our surroundings, as well as the abstractions of just human interactions or internet interactions, information.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
And I'll add this one to really encourage you listening right now to also consider going to some in-person men's program, because we can do all kinds of stuff alone. We can walk barefoot, we can work out, we can scream, we can do all that. But there's often a certain sort of capacity that we're limited by with just being with ourselves, with doing this kind of work in particular, and then going to an experience or a container where the point is to explore this kind of energy and to cultivate it and to become familiar with it and to have it be a generative, life-giving thing. Like, that's profound. That's profound. And a lot of times I'd say more often than we could ever even think, we need to be around other people doing that kind of work so that we can actually embody it ourselves. There becomes this sort of amplification effect or resonance that happens where we, through the process of doing the work, like we give each other permission to go deeper, and then we go deeper, and then you give permission to somebody else to go deeper, and then they take you there too. And because you're in that in-person container, it's so potent and profound. And I find that if I go too long without doing some sort of in-person work around cultivating some form of aliveness, maybe that's Qigong or sexuality or men's work or something, I start to feel like not great. I lose that zest, I lose that aliveness, I lose that certain spark that the world can just suck it out of us, So coming to in-person experiences that are generative for this kind of thing can be really powerful. Jeremy's been leading one for 10 years.
Yes.
And there are other options too, like you mentioned,
right.
like the Mankind Project, and there's a bunch of other things, but I would say that should be really highly up on the list too.
Definitely. Embodiment.
Yes. So when is yours coming up?
September 13th to 15th.
September 13th to 15th.
So this is our 10th annual. Very excited for that.
That's awesome. And that happens here in the Asheville Mountains?
In the mountains outside of Asheville.
Cool.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about it, or do you want to keep it secret?
I think I spoke a little bit to it earlier, but
you fire
in this
walk,
container, so we have these, we really embrace the 4-5 element model. And so it's multi-faith, like anyone can come. We have all different types of people from religious and spiritual backgrounds, as well as people who are agnostic or Gnostic, really important. Like there's so many ways to engage, but we encapsulate it in the sense of creating these direct embodied experiences in respect to the 4 elements, or often we tie in the spirit element as well, with some time for integration and processing and deeper embodiment outside of those contexts. We usually have men come in and share morning sessions with Qigong or how to make friction fires or Kung Fu, forest training, etc., which makes it really fun. Gives everybody an opportunity to dive in. Yoga, nice. Qigong,
Kung Fu forest training.
Yes,
I wasn't there the year I went. That sounds awesome.
That's true. It's good fun. So that's the essence of it. Yeah. So fire walks, live burials, oath ceremonies underneath waterfalls, crawling into caves, walking covered with mud through the forest at night, like just things that really invite us to connect to the earth and to share that experience with our brothers. Yeah.
So if you're listening and not seeing this on YouTube, I think you just missed something really important that I want to highlight too, is that when Jeremy just started talking about this, there was he smiled, there's a smile coming up and this other sense of aliveness in the playfulness. And I know we've been talking about all these serious concepts, but also just to name here at the end, play seems like a really important part of it too. It's not just you're seriously in the mud doing the deep hard work and it's arduous the whole time constantly. There's also this element of growth and learning through play that seems really important.
I mean,
too.
I have a blast the whole time.
Yeah.
I'm at play.
Awesome.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to name that because I can fall into that trap too, and I need to remember, play is crucially important as a human to thrive. I need that.
The fool is a crucial archetype.
Yeah, totally. So we'll put the links to the Wildman Retreat in the show notes, links to your website too. And just to name it too, also, Jeremy, a book of yours came out this year. I'll show it on the YouTube version. But yeah, I wanted to speak to this too briefly, just because it's really interesting to me. At the workshop where I was a month ago, it was a men's workshop, and one of the things that one of the leaders spoke to was, hey, by the way, if you want to connect with different, deeper spiritual traditions or shamanic lineages, you don't necessarily need to go to South America and drink ayahuasca. Nothing wrong with that, but if you're of European descent, there are actually certain lineages of spiritual traditions that were there, that went deep and were shamanic and were buried and covered up by a lot of colonialism and the church, etc. Not saying that to bash anything, but just to say that there are these traditions, and it sounds like this book is an exploration of some of those.
Very much so. So as my relationship with the wildman grew, or as I said earlier in the Irish, the Faroe, the the man of the forest, the green man. As that relationship evolved in me, I very quickly came to an understanding of like, I had stepped out of the social, environmental, Catholic upbringing that I had grown up with, and was finding answers in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in the Red Path. And while studying with a Hoshima woman in Flagstaff, Arizona in my late teens and early 20s, the door was opened inside of my consciousness through this woman and the work that we were doing to my own heritage, which my heritage is, from my mom's side, is Irish and German, and from dad's side is Swiss and German. So there was this hunger to go back to, as Delphina, my first teacher, said to me, she said, you need to go back to where your people come from. And this is the journey of the unfolding of the discovery, the remembrance, and the teasing out of the modern Irish mind, the depth of the traditions that are still conveyed in contemporary Irish culture that I think most Irish don't even recognize as being a continuum of those. Many of them do, of course, but some, it's just a part of a way of life. And so this book is that exploration of like understanding a cultural and historic context, but also like, how are the different places in nature and the ancient megalithic complexes, how have those been engaged traditionally? How have they, how do they rise in the ancient oral traditions that were transcribed into written traditions in the early Christian era, and thus presenting a template or a codex that the modern mind can engage with our Irish Celtic heritage and embrace that in a really beautiful way.
I'm excited to dive into this. One, because I'm interested in that topic, and two, because I'm excited to hear about your journey a little bit more. And just to close with an appreciation, I really appreciate how you're somebody who has a foot in the realm of the spiritual and the wild, and also in the realm of business and the world. And that integration is super important to me, and I think the world needs more of that. So thank you for being that person. Thank you for leading the Wildman retreats that you do and doing this work, and thanks for being here for this podcast. Really interesting, great conversation. I'm excited to share it with the world. And if you listening or watching have any questions for us, please leave a comment under the YouTube video. I'll get back to you. That's a great way to keep all the comments in one place. You can also shoot me an email if you don't feel comfortable with that for whatever reason. And yeah, we'll put a link to the book and your workshop and your website in the show notes. And thank you again, Jeremy, so much. This has been awesome.
Great. Thank you, Taylor.
Nice.
Yeah, man. Thank you. That was fun.
Totally.